Hey everyone, welcome to the Esports Research Report. I'm Steph Orm at Emmanuel College in Boston.
And I'm Brian McCauley here at the Media Management and Transformation Center in Jönköping, the city of DreamHack, all the way over the Atlantic in Sweden. And today our guest is back over to the USA, and we have Amanda Cote, who is a assistant professor in games and media studies at the University of Oregon. Welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, we're here to talk about your book, Gaming Sexism, because I forgot that part. Yes, there it is.
I was prepared. Got to show off that cover. It's beautiful.
It's so a very retro cover. It's got the image from the war, and it's got the power glove from that movie with Fred Savage.
Yep.
So our first question, as always, is your definition of esports.
That's a tough one, but what I usually go with is kind of the broader definition of esports. So any kind of organized competitive gaming, I would count as esports. I would say maybe at least semi-formal, like me having 8 friends over for a Halo LAN party. I probably wouldn't qualify as esports, but somebody organizing that on a slightly larger scale, I would count.
But hold on, if you have the 8 friends over for a Halo LAN party, and you win, I'm assuming you do a little victory dance and say something like, "In your face, that's what you get for trash talking me."
Yes, that's true. Although that rarely to never happened because my friends were mostly better at Halo than I am. I'm not super great at shooters. The aiming is not my forte.
I can identify with that so much.
So Amanda, we definitely want to talk about your book, right? Brian and I have been reading it. It's really great. So in it, you talk a lot about female players, right? And you found that a lot of them actually play games solo. Why is that? Why is that the case?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the reasons why I kind of did the book in the first place. In the early 2000s, we had the Nintendo Wii come out, we had the Nintendo DS come out, we had the rise of casual games. We had all these narratives all of a sudden saying, oh, look, there's all these places. Women are now half of all gamers. Games are diversifying and opening up. And at the same time, we had kind of a lot of sexist backlash against female gamers, the most dramatic of which is, of course, in the US, the Gamergate incident of 2014, when a lot of harassment was directed towards female players. So my question was, what are kind of individual female gamers doing during all of these events? How are they being affected by these changes in game culture? How are they being affected by these backlashes? Because when I looked at the field of game studies, I saw work on, women who wanted to be developers. There were organizations for them to connect with one another and bond. But I knew in my own experience, I didn't really know a lot of other women who played games. And I figured that that might be the case for others as well. So I really sought out, just regular everyday female gamers to talk to them about what their experiences were like. And one of the big findings was, as you said, that a lot of them didn't know other female gamers and actually spent most of their gaming time playing on their own. They occasionally played multiplayer games. One was really into Call of Duty, but they found that these were difficult to deal with. They tended to be targeted for harassment or trash talk. So they found that a lot of work had to go into playing online games and enjoying them. And so a lot of them ended up stepping back from online games and playing more single player games instead. Or if they were in multiplayer games, not necessarily telling people who they were, really controlling when they shared their identity and with whom. And so I thought this was really interesting because it meant that there were a lot more female gamers out there than it would necessarily feel like if you were in a multiplayer space. They were present, but not announcing their presence. And therefore, it would be really easy to overlook their contributions to game culture.
I was gonna say, I think you see some of that reflected in like the general discourse around these statistics that often come out, right? So like, I think you're talking about like the ESA report, right? Always putting out data every year about the gender breakdown. And I think a lot of men often, right, come out and say, there's no way that women are that much of the gaming population, right? And I think a big part of that is because we don't see them, right? Or we don't hear them. In many cases, because they've, again, maybe voluntarily kind of taken themselves out of that space, right, from being visible.
Yeah, and I think it ends up being kind of this cycle. So we have a long-standing stereotypes that games are more for men and boys than for women and girls. A lot of factors have kind of masculinized gaming. And then because of that, men might feel more empowered or more willing to be open about their presence in game spaces, while women might be more quiet, might hide their identity. That then makes those spaces feel more male dominated than they actually are and reinforces that expectation that games are for men and boys. So we've got this kind of cycle going on. Women have always been gamers. Gaming has always been more diverse than how we stereotypically think of it. But the recognition of that diversity is still lacking somewhat.
I mean, I play CSGO, and it's a hyper masculine environment. And I think I've around 60, 70 friends I've collected over the last few months, CSGO friends. And I think there's only one girl in that list, and it's a Norwegian woman, 30 years old. And I've played with her, and I've also played with her friend, who's now my friend, but he's from maybe, let's say, a culture that maybe would have a less equal sort of environment than Sweden or the US. And sometimes it feels like he's hitting on her with these remarks, and I'm a bit aware, and I'm going, is that one of the things that really hits, that guys kind of go, oh, hey, baby?
Oh my gosh, so much. So this was one of the really interesting things that came out with my participants. So I interviewed 37 female gamers to talk to them just about what their experiences were like. And it was really funny when I asked, have your experiences been like in multiplayer? Because they were one of two kind of dramatic responses. One was, it's been terrible. I've been harassed. I'm always told, go back into the kitchen and make me a sandwich. Some people had actually been, threatened. So there was that kind of very negative, get out of our gaming space as harassment. But on the other hand, a lot of people found that they got extra attention and offers of help. And people were so excited to find a female gamer that they were like, oh, tell me all about yourself. I'm so interested. And what's really interesting about that is that reaction of, oh, let me pay more attention to you because you're a female gamer, many felt that was just as off-putting as kind of the harassment, because both of these had the end result of making them feel abnormal and out of place, marking them as, hey, you're not a normal gamer. We're not going to treat you like a normal gamer. And so I have a chapter in the book that refers to this as implicit sexism. So where overt sexism is something like harassment and derogatory language, implicit sexism is something that might seem positive on the surface, but still rests on a fundamental inequality based on gender. And so this idea that female gamers get more attention or get hit on, even if that attention seems positive, it still marks them as out of place and makes them feel uncomfortable in gaming spaces.
Is that always happening to you, Brian? Are people sliding into your CSGO DMs?
Someone said, "I'll cover your B site" in a sexy voice to me the other day. I kind of liked it. It was unusual. It was, I was like, "Oh, that's the first time that's happened."
No, but imagine if it happened all the time. How would you react? It would be so exhausting.
I wouldn't like that. I actually said to the guy, "That's lovely. Thanks for that." I feel all warm inside. But I get ageism, and it comes up how old I am, and I say, oh, I'm nearly 40, and they go, "Oh my god, and you're still this crap," So but I can't imagine, and that's the challenge for me understanding. It's why I talk to people like you and Steph, and I try to understand, but it's impossible for me as a big middle class white guy who's lived in Asia and seen these cultures and seen in games the same thing I've seen in Vietnam or Taiwan to a certain extent in the realm of games that you wouldn't see in society. So that's why I read the book and I go, yeah. I mean, I think the only advantage for girls in games is that they have to spend a lot less on armor, because those metal bikinis are just as good. Us guys have to buy the big suits. I mean, chapter 4 is called, what's it called, Amanda? You say
it. Tits, Tokenism, and Trash Talk.
Best book chapter title ever.
I rather like it.
But that's immediately when I read that title, I thought about, the female armor paradigm. You're as a guy, I'm clomping along, and they're going, oh, this bikini will cover me and I won't get shot. Is that...
That was actually something that came up constantly in interviews, because I asked people, there's a lot of evidence that female characters in games tend to be hypersexualized in a lot of cases. You know, how do you feel about that? And a lot of them actually said that they were perfectly fine playing a sexualized character because they really enjoyed the opportunity to be attractive and sexy, but powerful and strong at the same time. But the metal bikini and high heels were two frequent design choices that they complained about, not because they didn't like being sexy, but because these were impractical for the world of the game. One went on an extensive rant about, what, do game designers think women don't have vital organs in their abdomens? Like, how can you make this choice and justify it in the world of the game? So it's actually really funny because I expected people to dislike sexualized character design because it can be objectifying and off-putting. And that really wasn't the case. They were actually kind of fine with sexualized character designs as long as it made sense in the world, and if they felt like the sexiness was for them as well as for a male viewer. So a lot of them actually really liked Bayonetta, one of the most hypersexualized female characters of all time, but they felt that Bayonetta's good looks were for her and were a form of power rather than kind of meant to objectify or diminish her.
Well, she's a mass murderer if you play the game through. So yeah, I mean, you know, there's other things we can throw at her. Like, she just goes around shooting people.
Yeah, but yeah, metal bikinis and high heels on characters that had to run and fight. Those were two big complaints that came up regularly.
I always laugh when I'm playing a game and I'm like scaling a mountain in high heels, and I'm like, ooh, what? Like, I won't even walk around Boston in high heels anymore because the cobblestones, like, first of all, destroy shoes, and B, it's so uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, Boston is particularly dangerous for high heels.
I mean, it's not. Look, here's Batman. I'm such a child. Look at that six-pack through the bat suit. You know, I mean, it's the only difference is I think is that I think the males are kind of hyper exaggerated versions of male stuff. But he's covered. He's only got his chin showing. I'm showing off my toys. I'm
Yeah, and that's actually a critique that's leveled at character design a lot, is like, oh, well, how can you complain about women being overly sexy when male characters are also super unrealistic and super exaggerated? And so I asked participants about that as well, and they said, well, the difference is power. They felt that female characters were often exaggerated so that they could be viewed and admired and objectified, and they felt that male characters were exaggerated so that they fit more into kind of a powerful role that you'd want to take on. So they said that they felt male characters were exaggerated for the player to feel better about themselves, and female characters were exaggerated to be looked at. And they felt that that was a fundamentally different level of power in how those characters were designed.
I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. And I think that's, you know, going back to the Bayonetta example, right? Because there's quite a bit that's been written about her as this like divisive feminist character, right? There's people who say like, oh, she's too sexy, right? She's hypersexualized. But like you were saying, right? And I know like Amanda Phillips in her recent book, you know, has a great chapter on that as well. All the Amandas of game studies.
Yes.
But again, like she's this really complex character. And again, she's in a lot of ways an awesome power fantasy, I think, for women, but that's she's such a rare thing, I think, that we get in games, right? And I think it matters that, again, we think of women as being a marginalized group within gaming culture broadly, right? So what does it mean to have the way that men and women are represented differently, right? And how does that impact you when you're a member of a marginalized group within actual gaming culture as well?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that like having a character be sexy is not an inherently bad thing, because it can be empowering. It's just when all you get are characters that fit a certain archetype, and when you feel like they were designed that way, not for you. Those are kind of the key things that really upset my participants.
In your book, there's a lot about identifying with the characters, and it just made me think that some of my favorite games are, well, you know, Last of Us. As a big example, and oh my god, that's one next Zero Dawn Horizon. I've just got something else.
Horizon Zero Dawn.
Horizon Zero Dawn, and what's her? You know, I got DLC and everything, and you know, Tomb Raider, of course. Yep, you've got her. I'm getting a better one. Competition time. But you know, so many of my favorite games have female protagonists, and it never throws me out. But then again, do I have to assume my white male privilege where I spend so much time running around as Master Chief or Batman or doing dragon uppercuts? Yeah, right. Is that where that happens? That I am overwhelmed and spoiled with my CS:GO characters, or Metal Gear Solid, and that I don't have to have a problem playing as these female characters because I'm represented so heavily already. Is that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And actually, I think Adrienne Shaw covers this really, really well in her book Gaming at the Edge, where she talks to what we might consider non-traditional or non-stereotypical gamers. So female gamers, gamers of color, and LGBT gamers. And she asks them a lot of questions about identification. And they say, oh, it's nice when it happens, but I don't really expect it because it is so rare. And she actually then digs a little bit deeper and finds that people are really good at finding things to identify with that aren't just identity based. So you might identify with somebody because they support your moral code, or you might identify with somebody because they don't take shit from others, and that's a characteristic you really want yourself. And my participants said the same thing. So Adrienne then uses this to advance an argument that we should diversify representations in games, not because diverse gamers have proved that they exist, but because you can always find something else to identify with. So why not diversify the types of stories we get? Because it shouldn't be off-putting to people who will find other characteristics or reasons to connect with that character. So I always really loved that she takes this moment of realizing that identity-based identification doesn't matter as much, and advances that into an argument as to why we should then continue representing diverse characters.
Such a good book. Yeah.
It is such a good book.
I haven't read that book, but her 2010 paper in Games and Culture underpins one of my papers about, it's not about the game stuff, it's the culture surrounding the game. Gaming culture is part of culture. And I think, whenever I'm going to do a paper along those lines, I mean, that's what your book kind of deals with, that gaming culture reflects an underlying sexist culture. I mean, the evidence is that women get colder easier than men, and most offices are set to the temperature that suit men. I know a few things. And so this is almost a reflection of a lot of issues in the world. And that's evidenced by me coming across this in esports in Sweden, in one of the most forward thinking, not equal, but one at least very forward thinking and working towards it. And esports obviously is maybe an exception in that, and it's not as accessible. So when we're talking about gaming culture, how do you relate that to esports?
Yeah, so I think the point you made about structures is really important here, because the way gaming culture currently exists, it's structured in ways that support certain types of gamers over others. And so, for instance, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the women I spoke with opted out of multiplayer gaming. And actually, over time, I followed up with a bunch of interviewees 5 years after I'd first spoken with them. And a lot of them had actually left video gaming entirely. They had actually turned to analog forms of games instead, because they felt that face-to-face communities tended to be more positive, so they didn't have to worry as much about harassment or negativity. So about 3/4 of the people I reconnected with had started playing Dungeons and Dragons, had not been playing Dungeons and Dragons in our first interview, switched over to it by our second interview. So that was dramatic, like a huge number of people. Others had gotten really involved in live action role-playing games, and one had even gotten really into competitive pinball. So to me, what this says is game culture has a lot of dropout. And so if we're talking about something like esports, you have to game for a while before you're good enough to compete at an esports level. Well, by the time people get there, certain types of players will have dropped out at a much higher rate than others. So for instance, I'm working with a research lab right now. We're studying North American collegiate esports teams. And we're talking to program directors, and they're like, oh yeah, we have a base level of skill required, but other than that, we don't ask people about their identity. That's how we try and get diverse teams. Except that you have to realize at that point, you're dealing with a pool of people where certain individuals have already dropped out of that pool. They've self-selected themselves out of esports spaces. And so I think these structures that promote gaming to certain people over others mean that by the time we get to a high level like esports, it's going to be kind of fundamentally unequal based on how things are right now. So I think we really need to do work at lower levels before we get to esports, to keep people in, to encourage gaming as a hobby for diverse players. And that's what we'll need to then solve the issue at the esports level that is, so male dominated on a global scale.
I'm thinking too about, what types of esports organizations, or like what types of titles and what genres of games, right, we call esports in the North American collegiate scene, right? And the things that are absent from those spaces. And I think that's really interesting, right? And those might be the types of games, that are maybe non-multiplayer, or that might appeal to more of these female players that you've been talking to. But because we don't regard them as esports, right, they're totally like discounted from that conversation, right? I'm thinking of things like, farming simulator, whatever it's called, right? I know like people made it into an esport. No, they did. It's like became an esport. And I'm constantly thinking about what it would mean to like expand the pool, right, of what we consider a viable esport, and what we form competitions around, and how that would also open up that playing field for a more diverse type of player, right, than even what we have already.
Yeah. So there's a really good book. Mia Consalvo and Christopher Paul wrote a book called Real Games, What's Legitimate and What's Not in Contemporary Video Games. And they talk about this idea of how gaming culture kind of builds a hierarchy, where certain kinds of games are seen as more legitimate or more what they call real than other types of games. And it tends to be ones produced by large companies that fit into kind of traditional platforms and traditional pricing and distribution models. And I would say that it also tends to be ones that have been perhaps more heavily masculinized in terms of content, marketing, etc. And so that translates to the esports space as well, where we get, where we perhaps see the League of Legends esports competition, not only because they've set that up so well and it's a solid global competition, but we see that as perhaps more real than something like Smash Brothers, which is more cartoony, less organized, and therefore perhaps not prioritized as much. So this hierarchy of what's legitimate and what's not has all these kinds of secondary add-ons about what we value in gaming culture that ends up kind of reinforcing a lot of stereotypes and differences.
I just love that you think the League of Legends is more real than Smash Brothers. Oh, we're just shooting the little goblins and hitting the dragon to collect the magical golden coins there before we destroy the crystal pillars with my wings and my knife thing. I mean, I can't understand it at all.
Well, and that's the thing, is like these are totally arbitrary decisions, as to what's real and what's not. They're totally culturally decided. There's flaws and gaps in all of them. That's one of the arguments I put forth in the book, is that our ideas about casual games versus core games are totally made up. And they just are based in what we've traditionally valued, and we could completely change what we value to open up gaming to more possible forms. Same thing's definitely true in esports. The idea of one esport being better than another tends to be pretty arbitrary.
I think too, the publishers are playing a big role in that, right? Like, like you said, Riot has set up League so well, right? It's like a masterclass in how to do esports in a lot of ways. Not that they're perfect, but I think a lot of publishers have modeled their tournament structures and leagues after them. But, I think then they play a role, right, in shaping like, this is what esports looks like, right? And then other people follow that success model. And then again, it kind of puts us in this like recursive circle of, it makes it harder for newer things, non-traditional things, to kind of break into that.
Well, no one develops esport titles anymore. I talk to a lot of game designers, and it's a closed shop. I'm going, do you know anyone? I talk to anyone who's trying to make an esport title, and I'm working with guys who have esport components in their games. And an Irish guy have him on the podcast making MOBA with a different thing, and he's looking at a leadership component in it that he wants to make more accessible for women. But it's almost just, these are the esports. You got to be really good or really different to break in now. And of course, that what comes with that is the entrenched cultural norms and all these things that are hard to break free of. That, like, toxicity. Face It has got the AI now, Minerva, trying to reduce toxicity in CSGO by text speak and by voice speak, but you can't be perfect with that, right? So I mean, is there room for a kind of, is there room for a new esport that could just start as equal in terms of gender?
I don't know. I think maybe, but I don't know if I'd say that's actually what I want. I think what I'd want, and for instance, what my participants want, is more equitable access to gaming in all of its forms. And so I would say that I'm not willing to give up on our current esports in the hopes that we could create a more equal one. I want us to make all of our current esports more accessible. And there are ways to do that. You know, one of the challenges has just been, for so long, people have kind of treated their game communities as unmanageable and have not taken moderation steps and have not applied penalties for people who are being really terrible. And I think we're starting to see a shift in that. We're starting to see people realize, like, hey, we're a really legitimate enterprise. We have millions of people playing this game across the world. Maybe we should give some thought as to what those people are actually doing. And so we're seeing things like the Apex Legends ping system, where you can kind of call for help without having to use voice. A lot of my participants were really fond of things like that because it let them control when and to whom they revealed that they were female players. We've started seeing auto bans for if you type racial slurs into chat. Those have been added to a lot of games. And so I kind of want to see more of those initiatives. And at the esports level, something like making sure you have human moderators at a live event and making sure that they've been trained to deal with issues. I think that could really go a long way to changing the norms. I'm not saying we have to get rid of trash talk. You know, ribbing your opponent to try and throw them off their game is a normal part of competitive play. But getting rid of trash talk that's based around, for instance, sexist, racist, or homophobic language, I think should be a priority towards making games more inclusive. And AnyKey, the wonderful advocate organization AnyKey, actually has some really good resources on training moderators and how moderators can be made more effective. They argue that esports organizations should make sure they write codes of conduct, post them publicly, and enforce them. And so they've got great recommendations for things we could already be doing now to deal with issues of toxicity and inequality.
I was up in northern Sweden at you'd say it's Nordsken Nutrien Festival, which is esports, and you guys would love it. It's so geeky. Baby Yoda's everywhere. And it's run by the people in the Arctic Game Lab, and it's in northern Sweden. And CB Cebalewski, the Marvel chief editor, was there. It was wicked. And I was going to work with my friend Max. I was going to interview him. And he was president of the Swedish Association at the time. And he had to moderate a tournament by female legends. I'm like, Max, where are you? Come on, get this interview done. He's like, dude, I'm moderating this. I can't leave it. And so I tuned into the chat around it. And yeah, I was like, oh, Jesus, okay. And also there was a Brazilian team in there. So there was a lot of Portuguese chat. And they were like, should I flag this? Is this Portuguese or is it some sort of swear term? I don't know. But, you know, he couldn't get away from it because of this toxicity by the audience. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the esports audience. Let's not just talk about competing. What are the issues there from what you did in your book and from talking about audience? Maybe it's for streamers or competitive play, but how does the audience impact on these sort of things?
So I think that all of these are kind of interconnected. Again, going back to kind of the structures, game culture has been structured in particular ways, and that affects everyone who's part of it. It affects the assumptions developers make when they design and pitch new games. It affects the behavior players engage in while they're playing, how they react to others around them. And then, yeah, in esports, it would also affect the audience. And so this idea that trash talk is okay and that all forms of trash talk are normal and okay, and it's just an outlet of competitive gaming, that to me is the big norm that needs to be changed. One of my favorite examples of this is I love the Xbox Live community guidelines. I don't know if you've seen these, but they are trying to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of trash talk. And so they say an acceptable form is, their example is something like, that sucked, go away and come back when you get good. The reason they say that's acceptable is because it's not directed at anybody based on their, for instance, identity. The example they give of unacceptable trash talk is, you suck, get out of my country and don't come back until you get good. And so like both of these are about, hey, that was a bad game, get good, negativity, but one of them is based on nationality and ideas of belonging, and the other is not. And so I really like this example, even though it kind of makes me chuckle, because it's, to me, evidence that like we don't have to get rid of competitive trash talk. We don't have to get rid of that as a player strategy, but we do need to pay attention to what kinds of trash talk are acceptable, and ones that are specifically targeted at individual identities, I think need to fall more towards the less acceptable side.
I really don't like the unoriginal stuff. Oh my God. It's just like, guys, put some effort in, be creative. I don't. I'm very positive. I've got more accommodations to being friendly on CSGO without even trying. I'm not boasting. It's just I naturally go, this is great. We can do it. We're 11-0 down. We can do it. But sometimes someone will cross the line just by being annoyingly repetitive and uncreative, and then I'll just go blah, 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 and their own team will be laughing at them. And I just don't go against a 40-year-old Irishman. with your repetitive insults, and that's what drives me. And see, that's the thing. That's where I get, intimidated. Just by I'm annoyed how crap you are at it, because that's my experience, and I think that's the issue. But there are times I go, if I wasn't me, and I do consider this, like if I'm going, fucking, I'm sitting here in my home office and my apartment, I own my job and everything. I'm grand. My parents aren't on my back right now. If they are, I'd be, what the hell are you doing here, guys? I'm 40. But that it's, I can imagine that a lot of this comes from it. Sometimes I say to my team, look, just lads, he's probably 15 and, falling behind in school. And there's external factors that drive this. It's not necessarily that they're absolute arseholes. Because you guys remember being a teenager.
Yes.
Like, could you imagine it being stuck at home? Like with your parents on your back going, have you done your homework? I've been online for 10 hours in school. So there's external factors. I don't believe there's as many toxic people as we think. Well, if you guys get your student evaluations, right, as a teacher in the university, best lecturer ever, bit of a dickhead. And you're going, I'm a bit of a dickhead. And it's just those insults, the negative ones. He's a bit immature. Yes, I am. But that's what you remember, right? So the toxicity is also a thing, and just that's why I hate the most that it's such a small percentage of people that can do so much damage to more vulnerable people than me, and that's what the sad thing is. And and again, look, I can't imagine you both of you probably had experiences that would make me shudder in terms of what's been said to you.
Well, Amanda mentioned earlier, her participants kind of talking about playing these games as like work. And this is actually a theme that's come up in recent things that I've been writing about why women might not play certain games or play games at all. And, games are a time commitment. There are all these other things, right? But a lot of times they're an emotional commitment, right? And Amanda, maybe you can speak to more things about that. But like, I think of a lot of times when I go to play a multiplayer game, I have to put myself in a certain mindset where, like, if I'm going to interact, and I tend to play with strangers because, like many of Amanda's participants, I don't know a ton of women who also play or play the same games that I do. And so I have to like psych myself up, right? To, go and play with a headset or if I'm going to type in chat or whatever, because I know that like there's always that possibility there might be some assholes in there. And, then I have a round where someone is really toxic and terrible, and then maybe I tap out, right? And I, like so many women, right, will drop out, but drop out permanently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was definitely the case. It was really interesting. Like, these players loved games. Loved gaming, firmly stated that the majority of their game experiences were positive. But it was really interesting how much work they had put into ensuring that. Even though, as you said, Brian, toxic gamers are a vast majorry of
minority. I didn't say they're majority. Minority.
Vast minority. Far lower. Sorry, I haven't finished my coffee yet. Vast minority compared to gamers. The majority of gamers are just there to play and have fun. But the chance that you're going to run into a toxic player was kind of something that women felt they always had to prepare for. And so a lot of them didn't play multiplayer games at all, only played with people they knew, took active steps to hide their gender, both in terms of, for instance, not using voice chat, but also in terms of choosing what they saw as gender-neutral usernames. They felt like even if they were playing a male avatar, if anything in their username gave away that they might be female, they found they got harassed. Some got really good at the game, because then if people were negative to them, they could dismiss it as like, oh, they're just jealous, I'm better at them. And then some practiced, being aggressive and trash talking themselves. And these mostly worked. Some of them were more psychological protection, like getting really good. Others were stopping harassment from happening in the first place by hiding your gender. But they all took time, energy, and as Steph pointed out, emotional preparation. And so that was why when I reconnected with the same participants, so many of them had stopped playing video games because as they got older, as they got more responsibilities at work, at home, with their families, they just didn't have the time to do that prep anymore. And so playing, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons with 5 people they knew in person, they didn't have to do that mental preparation of like, am I going to be harassed today or not? Am I ready to deal with it?
Look, I pull out the line. I'm a big white guy and I've all this confidence, but there's moments in CSGO where I'm having a shit game and I'm feeling so small and someone starts at me and I'm just going, fuck you. I mean, but like really, I'm keeping a diary. This is a research project and it actually, just makes me feel terrible despite everything. So that impact on me, you said they get good and I'm like, oh, when I'm playing well, I'm better able to handle them, but toxicity disimproves my performance, I think, so much. And I've recorded that in the diary. So I had like 8 kills and 10 deaths. And then this guy started on me and I got 2 more kills the last 20 rounds. And even when it's not directed at me, even when there's one guy bullying another guy, my performance just dips. And I just, it's so, yeah, I just imagine it's like what happens to me, but magnified. That it's because you are emotionally invested, and if a toxicity happens in a game, that's an hour of your life gone. That was supposed to be a fun hour, that they've taken away from you. I hate it. I'm really nasty to the toxic people. I bully the bullies. That's the only thing I keep from my recorded diaries is the actual insults I use, because they're very good. But it's only when someone literally pushes me past the point by just being an awful person, ruining an experience. I've had the experience that you get 2 guys log in, they're muted on CSGO, and they spin in a circle for the entire game.
Like they're trolling you.
No, they're trolling the entire 8 other players in the game, and there's 2 of them, so you can't vote them off. And I couldn't believe this. They literally logged in to do nothing except ruin a game for 8 people. And so that minority, that was way worse than everything else. That was that was just a toxic bomb going off for the whole game. It wasn't even 1 or 2 people. So there is that's why I'm trying to face it now as a part of that research project, to shift from matchmaking to face it, to see the differences when people are reported and that toxicity is removed. But the sad thing is, I know one girl I've played with a couple of girls who were friends of mine in esports associations, but through my own solo queuing, 1 female friend out of 70 that I've added. And I think that's very sad. That is a thing. So casual games, Amanda, so we can get through some important points, because how do you deal with casual games being tied up with gender identity, I think, is something we wanted to ask you.
Yeah, so we actually kind of got to this a little bit earlier when we were talking about, how certain esports come to be prioritized over others. But one of the kind of cornerstones of my book was around the rise of casual games, from the Nintendo Wii and the Nintendo DS, which brought casual, to the home consoles and handhelds, to the rise of social mobile casual games, things like Farmville and Candy Crush. These were really interesting because what I found in my analysis is that people really pinned the rise of female gamers to the rise of casual games. And so, of course, that neglects the fact that women have always played games and that they play a diverse array of games, including competitive shooters. And it also starts to really emphasize a hierarchy in games where, like, okay, women can come, but only if they play those casual games, that's where they're supposed to be. So it ends up with this kind of divide about people's appropriate places to play. And my participants found that really frustrating because, of course, I was speaking to women who self-identified as gamers, which meant that they played a lot of games, both casual and what we might consider more hardcore. And they didn't like being relegated to one section versus another. They found it really frustrating when they walked into a game store and bought Call of Duty and Cooking Mama, and the clerk assumed that Cooking Mama was for them and Call of Duty was for someone else. And so we see this kind of again, this division of what's casual versus what's hardcore has a lot of other associated connections to it. Gender, your level of commitment to gaming, your level of skill, how much you're willing to invest. They don't hold up on close inspection. There are a lot of so-called casual gamers who play in really hardcore ways, but these terms still do ideological work about what we value and what we don't. And when we translate that to something like esports has tended to fall on that more hardcore side. So it comes with all that baggage of all those associations as to who can be hardcore and who can't. So that's also a potential barrier to a lot of players looking to get into that space.
I mean, the rise of mobile and casual games, that's where you saw the statistics from companies, Nielsen, Newzoo, whatever. And, I was in my PhD as that did. But I'm wondering now, after listening to you, whether that rise of female participation in mobile games was because it was a safe space by yourself to engage with a game. So, a cause of effect sort of role reversal. So I guess the question is, will there be a similar thing that maybe mobile esports allow female gamers to engage in esports in what is, well, the most personal device any of us have, the one that we spend much more time with than our related partners or pets?
I don't know what mobile esports will do, but I'm hopeful and optimistic because, of course, esports have a lot of barriers in terms of, for instance, class. A gaming computer that allows you to compete at the highest levels is a big investment. And so I'm kind of hoping that the rise of mobile esports helps open esports up in general to lots of different players by getting rid of, for instance, that need for an investment in a hardcore gaming machine. And then also, yes, the ability and access that we all have to mobile phones, I think will also do a lot of work in terms of gender, race, and sexuality as well. Because there are trends in, for instance, among children whose parents buy them computers or gaming machines and who don't. It does still tend to be boy children have better access to those things than girl children. So that already starts the path of divide. And so mobile, which everyone has access to, I don't know how people live without cell phones these days, could be a way of redressing that. So I don't know for sure how mobile gaming will turn out at the esports level, but I'm looking forward to it. I think it's a potential space to address a lot of concerns.
Just because it did come up, right? And I happen to know there's actually a very vibrant esports, like mobile esports scene in China. One of the most popular esports titles is a mobile compatible game. And but I haven't seen any gender breakdown data come out.
54%. Yeah? I just wrote it in a paper. Yeah,
really?
It's Clash of Kings or something. 54%.
Yeah, it's I forget what it's called. Something Kings, right? That's super interesting to me. So there's hope.
I didn't explain it in the paper. I was kind of like, look, this just happened. It's an innovative thing. Tencent have had a long-term strategy towards mobile games, being the world's biggest game company. And yeah, so that is actually fascinating. And actually I was kind of thinking we should do a paper on that and research that, because I'd be interested to know why that game has been so successul among females. But then it's in China. It's mostly in China. And I was in China a couple of years ago, and I was visiting my brother, and I took cash out of an ATM, and he goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "I need money for stuff." And he goes, "Your phone?" I'm like, "My phone doesn't work here." And everyone just uses their phone for everything. It's all through Alibaba. They're a phone society. And then we went to a nightclub, and you couldn't hear anything, and everyone was on their phones. And I go, what's the point of coming to a nightclub? Because nobody's interacting, they're on their phones. And I was living in Vietnam at the time, and I used to look at the middle-aged men in the alleyway I lived in playing on their iPad and going, "Geez, this is a mobile first thing." So about China blew me out of the water. And maybe that's the relationship with mobile. I hope we don't go where China's gone for the mobiles. I think we're getting there. But that's an amazing thing, and maybe that based on how much I read most of your book, that that safe space that the mobile is perceived as. I mean, it is. It's where you do all your most personal things. So maybe
yeah. In the book, I argue that, for instance, casual and mobile games are potentially what I call counter-hegemonic forces. So the hegemonic understanding of games, the stereotype has been that games are for men and boys, games are for people who are willing to invest a lot of money and time in technology and getting really good. And I argue that the rise of casual games could potentially redefine that and lead to a broader acceptance of lots of styles of gaming and lots of types of gamers. But there's also this risk that if casual games continue to be seen as less real, again, to go back to Consalvo and Paul's argument, than more traditional console games, that's a potential to just reaffirm the system rather than change it. So I think they are counter-hegemonic forces. I'm hopeful that they will succeed on that front, but I wouldn't say it's a guarantee.
So now that you've finished your book, right? What new projects are on the horizon for you?
So one that's really exciting and really relevant to today's conversation is I'm now part of a research lab, an interdisciplinary research lab here at the University of Oregon that's studying specifically collegiate esports teams and how they rise, how they institutionalize, and what that means for colleges. So we have 5 faculty members, 3 in the School of Journalism and Communication with me, 1 in English, and 1 in the School of Business. And then we have 4 amazing graduate students, each of who brings their own interest to the study of esports. So for instance, one of them, Jared Hansen, is really interested in kind of nostalgia games, how people maintain servers once a game goes away. This is really relevant to esports, right? Because what do we do with Hearthstone when support for it goes away? A lot of collegiate teams have already gotten rid of their Hearthstone players, so that's a question. Another, Brandon Harris, is interested in live streaming and Twitch. Also a big question around esports is how people build their communities and their spaces and what kind of work goes into that. And then our 2 others, Undar Khan and Wasik Rahman, are really interested in, Undar's from Turkey, so he's comparing kind of the US esports infrastructure to the Turkish esports infrastructure.
I love that stuff.
Oh, it's so great. And then Wasik's really interested in kind of player psychology and how players respond to esports versus non-competitive games. I'm probably not describing his research well, but it's really fascinating. And so right now we're studying collegiate organizations across the United States. We're talking to players, we're talking to program directors, we're talking to administrators, just to figure out what is this collegiate esports thing? It seems to be a particularly unusually North American institution. It sort of aligns with a lot of collegiate sports like football and basketball, but not, because it's totally different advisory bodies, if any advisory body at all. We're interested in why colleges want esports teams in the first place. How are they using these for their own purposes? So there's just so many questions about this particular branch of esports that we're interested in talking about.
To see my response to this, just go back to Will Parton's podcast and see how I kind of talked about the neoliberalism capitalistic approach to esports in the US compared to the almost non-existent one here in Europe, where it's a different model. I mean, an impossible question to answer because it'll be changed by the time you get to the answers, which is esports is why we will also have jobs, because it keeps changing, right?
And it's so fascinating because we're in really early stages of research right now, but we'll start presenting papers over the next couple months. We're finding that there is no one model of collegiate esports. Some schools, you put it in their athletics department and offer athletic scholarships, and others put it in their student life and it's meant to be kind of a recruitment effort. Look at, we've got this cool new esports thing. And so different programs and different sizes of schools are using it for totally different purposes. So there's a lot of fascinating questions there. And of course, my interest is in gender and identity and access. Collegiate is a really interesting place because in the United States, there's a Title IX mandate that colleges ensure equitable access to educational opportunities regardless of identity. Well, esports tends to be a particularly male-dominated space. So how are colleges going to deal with that? How should they deal with that? It's a really potentially rich site of investigation into those questions.
Wait a second. How do they deal with the American football side of the big money spinner?
I don't know if we have time to get into all of that.
Is there an empty stadium of large women crashing into each other just to do equality measures? I mean,
there's a lot of different approaches that one can potentially take to that. But for instance, many schools offer more women's sports teams in smaller sports like field hockey, cheerleading, volleyball, etc., than they do male sports teams to make up for the football gap. But it's a really complicated
less murdery sports, less fatal injury sports. All we want, cheerleaders. We lead the cheers. American football, they don't kick the ball. It doesn't make sense. That's something I didn't know. That that there's the diversity. I mean, is there room for just a huge question that comes up in interviews and topics everything about female-only competitions? Is that a thing that could happen in the American collegiate scene? Or should it happen?
No. I still have yet to figure out my own feelings on this because feelings among, for instance, female players are really divided on this, where many are like, yeah, it would be great to have a space where it was all women and perhaps we'd be less set up for this harassment and toxicity, but others strongly want to just be treated as normal gamers. And so I don't know if I have an answer to that because I don't think players have an answer yet to what they feel would most benefit them. So I think it's going to be trial and error, trying a couple of things and seeing what works. But there is a lot of debate around that question of, is this a necessary step towards getting more involvement among diverse esports players, or would this be a step back because it would kind of institutionalize the divided gender approach to esports like traditional sports rather than letting it do something different?
Before we ask you the last question, I have one more question. When you talk about diversity in gaming, I do have a CSGO friend who has quite a serious disability and he requires a carer. He's a really good player, actually. I love playing with him. Really cool dude. The issues of accessibility to games for disabled players, would that be a part of your research? And there's the blind guy who plays Street Fighter by sound. He's amazing. But is this a potential stream for you to investigate that the accessibility and obviously someone with some sort of disability can't go play American football. They can play Murder Ball, that brilliant wheelchair rugby thing. Best documentary ever. Made me cry. Only thing it ever has. But is that a topic of research that is viable? How games can enable people with disabilities to access communities? Because I've seen people with cerebral palsy using tournaments here as a means of socializing, and it's just something that really I love to see. Is that
So I don't know if I'll end up moving into that space because there's already a lot of people who do really good work on it. The one who comes to the top of my mind right now is actually my colleague here at the University of Oregon, Donna Davis, studies how people with disabilities use Second Life, their connections to their avatars, what spaces like Second Life offer to them, what the limitations on that are. There's also some really good research into for instance, controller redesign and how people redesign controllers to be able to play games against disabilities or start to play games while accounting for different abilities. I feel like in many ways, my current research might make it difficult to engage in that space because I talk to people who self-define as gamers. And again, to go back to Adrienne Shaw, who writes all the really great articles, she has one about, do you identify as a gamer or not? And finds that people who fit the stereotype of a traditional gamer, the closer you are to that, kind of the more likely you are to identify as a gamer, whereas the further you are from that, the less likely you are. So this is why when I was looking for female gamers, if you look at the chart of who I spoke to, they're mostly white and mostly college educated, because those two things move them closer to gamer identity. They only differ on the axis of gender rather than on the axis of multiple identities at once. And so I'm thinking about how my future work can do things differently to avoid that kind of self-selection out of participants. But yeah, so maybe, I guess, is the short answer to the question, but I'd have to do some serious change in how I recruit.
Yeah,
sure.
I know in Sweden it's illegal to ask someone about their ethnicity in a research project, by the way. You guys asked me when I landed in an airplane in your country.
So Amanda, what do you hope to see other oh my gosh, what do you hope to see other esports researchers? There we go. What topics do you want to see other people tackle?
So I think this collegiate thing is really interesting and really unusual. It's a whole new addition to the global esports industry. So if anyone wants to come, join us in the collegiate research, you are welcome to do so. I'd love more people to talk to. But then I really do think that it's important that we think about the structures of gaming and how those make it easier for certain players to succeed than others. And so I would really like more research into building sustainable communities. So community management, community moderation, as Brian pointed out earlier, moderating an esports tournament is a ton of work, but it seems like it works. It seems like it helps make moderated tournaments more accessible and more inclusive than tournaments that don't have that. So I'd really like more work into what kinds of community management and moderation techniques work and how can we apply them more broadly across gaming spaces. I think that's a really fruitful area of research that would have real lived impacts on people's day-to-day lives so that we can all have more positive experiences when we game rather than being frustrated at somebody being a jerk.
That's great. I mean, look, I just thought of my cats when you talked about the moderation there, because I know they get up on those tables when we're not there. And they're like, hey, we're the moderators. Get down, Johnny, get down.
And the goal, right, is eventually you'll teach them not to do that even when you're not around. It's kind of the same thing with game community norms. The more we mark identity-based harassment as unacceptable in game spaces, hopefully the less it will happen even when a moderator is not there. So that's the long-term goal, is to shift the norms of gaming to where like trash talk, like the Xbox example of, wow, that sucked, come back when you get good, where that's the norm rather than get out of my country until you get good. Like, there are norms that we can shift here.
Love it.
Okay, thanks very much, Amanda. That was great. If this is audio, if this is video, information about what Amanda's doing is below this in whatever links are on, whatever format you are. Her book, yep, there it is. Gaming Sexism is actually really good, and I promise I've finished 70% of it, but Steph has read the whole thing, and I will finish it because I actually liked it.
I like to hear it. That's good.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. And Amanda, thanks so much for taking time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Step back,